Juan Williams, author of Thurgood Marshall, American Revolutionary. How much time did you spend around the man?
I had a real privilege, Brian. I got to interview Marshall for a 6-month period in 1989, beginning in about June, ending in about December, and then in several visits to his chambers in a year or so after that. Got to know Thurgood Marshall, and this was at the end of his career, end of his life. It was a rich time, and one in which he was willing to talk. I felt, it's been a great gift for me.
How many hours?
I have in hand about 20-something hours of taped interviews with Marshall, and some of the interviews weren't taped, but I would guess if you boiled it down to hours, 2 days, 48 hours or so that I could say in lifetime I spent in his presence.
What was he like?
That's tough, but I think that one of the interesting things you do as a writer, as you go over someone's life, is you see them at different moments, so they have different incarnations and different ways of being. But at the time that I knew him as a person, he was sort of a curmudgeonly, witty old man, a guy who was suffering from glaucoma. His eyes would tear up occasionally. He wore those white socks because he had circulation trouble in his leg, walk with a cane. A man who told me he ate his Campbell's soup for lunch every day because he'd had enough surprises in life. He liked the consistency of Campbell's soup. So that's what he was like at that time. He was into being the curmudgeon.
Here's a picture of him at his desk. Where is that?
In the Supreme Court. That was in his chambers at the Supreme Court. And if you look carefully on that desk, you'll see there's a bust of Frederick Douglass, another famous Baltimore person, Marshall having been born in Baltimore. And also, that was a wonderful room he had, because on the wall he had skins from trips to Africa. He had helped to write the Kenyan Constitution back in 1960. He'd been friends with Jomo Kenyatta, had gone back for celebrations, and he had spears on the wall as well. So very interesting chamber.
Quote here from, I had it here, I think here it is. Thomas Crattenmaker, a professor at Georgetown University Law Center, quote, "He is certainly the most important lawyer of the 20th century."
Right.
Do you agree with that?
I think that's right. Now, I can't claim to have studied every lawyer in the century, but if you do a quick survey in your mind, if you think about who has changed the legal landscape in the country, you'd have to put Marshall up there. This is very interesting because in this town in Washington, D.C., Marshall felt greatly underappreciated by the legal community. And in fact, there were people who argued at the time of his confirmation first to the Second Circuit in the early 60s and then to the Supreme Court that he really wasn't that great a lawyer, that he wasn't a brilliant legal mind. But what he did nonetheless was he was able to gather strings together from legal thought and legal argument, make the presentation. Most people in the legal fraternity will say he was an outstanding advocate. He could stand before that Supreme Court and argue like no other. He was before the court as an advocate 32 times, won 29 of those cases. Before the court, in terms of his Solicitor General work, outstanding. I think he was there 19 times and won 14 of those cases. If you look at his record on the Second Circuit, he was never reversed by the Supreme Court, wrote few dissents there in the Second Circuit. What you see is that this is a winner. This is someone who is shifting the terms on which people are thinking and arguing about legal issues. And when you consider that I think everyone would agree the greatest political and social problem that the United States has faced in this century has been race relations as a domestic issue, Marshall, it seems to me, stands as a titan, a giant, in terms of how he has restructured the terms in which we consider and argue and think about race in America.
How many years did he live?
He was born 1908 in Baltimore and dies 1993, is it? Yes, 1993. He's been dead 5 years.
And you talk in the early part of this about the difficulty of getting into the University of Maryland Law School.
Correct.
Why?
Well, Marshall was black, and at the time that he is ready to go to law school, right after graduating from Lincoln University in Oxford, Pennsylvania, the University of Maryland Law School was not accepting any applicant who was black. And Marshall really needed the opportunity to go to his state law school because his family didn't have much money. He was a middle-class black kid in the city of Baltimore. His father had been a Pullman car porter and then a steward at the Gibson Island Country Club off the Chesapeake Bay. His mother was a school teacher, but they had another son who had just gone through college and who had had a difficult time paying the tuition bill for college because Thurgood's father had become ill. That son, Aubrey, was now in medical school, and they were paying the medical school bills, and now here came this young man, Thurgood Marshall. The parents actually had thought that Aubrey was the star of the family, and Thurgood really wasn't as serious a student. But here came Thurgood, who wanted to go to law school, and the ideal would have been for Thurgood to go just down the street. The University of Maryland Law School, being in Baltimore, would have been for him to go to the University of Maryland Law School, but they weren't accepting blacks, and so he applied instead to Howard University Law School, would get on a train about 5 a.m. every morning from Baltimore, ride to Washington, D.C. To attend classes, not get back home till after midnight.
So I've got a picture I want to show. This one right here has got one of his mentors in it.
Charlie Houston.
Yeah. What benefit did it eventually turn out to be for him that he went to Howard?
It turned out to be a wonderful thing, a godsend, in that Charlie Houston...
Which one is he in this picture?
Charlie Houston is, I guess from the viewer's perspective, to the right of Marshall.
This gentleman right here?
Correct.
Okay.
And Houston had gone to Amherst, had been a Harvard law grad, had taken part in World War I, had defended black soldiers in World War I, and had a strong sense of what he wanted to do. And what he wanted to do was to make Howard University Law School into a training ground for lawyers who were going to change the world. And he had noticed that at the time that he was involved with Howard, this is in the 1920s, there were about 1,000 black lawyers in the United States, only 100 of them practicing in the South. And overwhelmingly what he was hearing from judges was you could tell the work of a black lawyer almost immediately because it was of such poor quality. The briefs were poorly written, there were misspellings, things were improperly done. And what Houston wanted to do was to transform Howard University Law School. It had been a night school. Lots of people were sort of just passing through there. The professors were part-time, not seriously committed. Houston decided to make it a day school. He got the powers of Howard University, the school that had been founded as a school to educate freed slaves, to go behind this notion that a first-rate law school to train first-rate black lawyers was necessary in America, and that's what he set out to do. And so for Marshall, it was wonderful suddenly to come into this tradition of excellence, that here was someone who was going to make demands on him, push him to be absolutely the best lawyer, and offer him experiences, because Houston had such a wide network of connections. He was already doing some work for the NAACP. At one point, Houston has Marshall help him on a criminal case in Virginia where a man is charged with the murder of a white woman and taken up. He runs away to Boston. There's a question of extradition. Marshall gets involved in doing research. They bring him back. Marshall is there again to help as the case is argued. And to have the experience of what it's like to be a lawyer and to feel the excitement and to feel the thrill and to connect with the idea that this is about more than just winning cases. This is about changing the sociology of America with regard to race.
What was the condition of the black-white relationships back in 1933 when he graduated from Howard?
Wow, that was a difficult time. You got to remember this is right after the Depression when Marshall makes the decision to open his private practice in Baltimore. He can literally from his window, his office window, see bread lines. He realizes that he doesn't have much of an opportunity here to establish a practice. He's not going to get much in the way of business from whites, but he hopes that he's going to get business from blacks. That's ironic because as it turns out, many of the black people who needed lawyers at the time said, hey, gee, if you really need a lawyer, you better get a white one who has the contacts in the court system. There were no black judges, few black politicians. After he had started this practice, the man who was in the same building with him, the major black lawyer in Baltimore, a man named Warner McGuinn, who was a Yale Law School graduate. Just as an aside, Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain had helped to pay his tuition to get him through law school. But anyway, Warner McGuinn had said, young man, you have a wonderful brain. I'd love to exploit it, but you need to go out and be on your own. And Marshall ends up really representing people involved with personal injury, accident cases, divorce cases, anything he can get from a pretty much small black clientele. Race relations in the country were poor. There still was a great deal of tension. There were still incidents of lynching going on. But more to the case and more to the point for Marshall, there was little opportunity, little hope that he was going to have success as a lawyer. There was little business for him.